Nice little cycle here. And again, sometimes we call this the short cycle because it doesn't take millions of years for carbon to go from this to this to this. It can take a very short amount of time compared to the time it takes to form fossil fuels, for example. Okay, now, not every plant or plant-eating animal is going to get eaten itself, okay? Sometimes a plant will just die. But remember, the carbon in the form of sugar is still there. So if these organisms end up dying, meaning nothing ate it, and get buried and under just the right temperature, pressure, and millions of years it takes, they could possibly form fossil fuels. Okay, it's mostly dead plants that form fossil fuels, and that is our main source of energy at present. Again, all fossil fuels are carbon and hydrogen based, so it should make sense that our plants and animals, which are organic substances, are forming them. So fossil fuels, again, form mainly from dead plants. In order to form fossil fuels, you need the right amount of three things: pressure, temperature, and time. Millions of years it takes to form fossil fuels. That's why we classify them as a non-renewable energy source. Let's add that into our diagram here. So the way we access these fossil fuels is by mining, drilling, fracking, whatever. And once we get them as a resource, we then burn them, okay? We combust them. When we do that, those hydrocarbons, and you should remember, combustion means we're joining something with oxygen. Okay, so we take our hydrocarbon. In this case, in this formula, or this chemical equation, I just used methane as an example. It could be any fossil fuel because they all have very similar chemical equations or chemical formulas. We're going to join it with oxygen. The only two things that are going to be produced are carbon dioxide and water vapor. And where's that going to go? Up into the atmosphere. So we are taking all these hydrocarbons that are buried deep in the earth, we're combusting them, and we're pumping that CO2 into the atmosphere, into that sink, right? That reservoir. We call this the long cycle because, I'm sure you understand, it takes a lot longer than the short cycle. So the atmosphere provides CO2 to plants. Plants use the CO2 to synthesize food that the animals then eat. When those plants and animals then die, fossil fuels can be formed over millions of years from their remains. We then drill or mine those fossil fuels and use them by burning them as an energy source. That's going to allow all of that carbon that was stuck down underground to get pumped into the atmosphere. So this is where the problem is, guys. Up until a few hundred years ago, okay, this part of the cycle did not exist because humans did not exist in the modern form. We did not have the Industrial Revolution until very recently. So these natural stages were all in perfect harmony and perfect balance. And again, it's a theme you keep hearing in this unit. Nature will take care of itself beautifully until we interfere, and then things change, unfortunately. So we are taking the nice balance of carbon in all the different reservoirs and upsetting that balance extremely by pumping, billions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And therein lies the problem. Okay, the carbon cycle. Let's take our notes. Our focus is what are the processes in the carbon cycle and where is carbon stored on Earth? We're going to define the carbon cycle as a series of processes by which carbon compounds move between different reservoirs. And again, the reservoirs are the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the biosphere. And remember, the problem is we're pumping CO2, okay, carbon in the form of CO2, up into the atmosphere faster than the atmosphere can get it down into the other parts of the system. Carbon compounds provide us with food, so go ahead and put it sugars and carbs. And I have a chemical formula here. It's a generic chemical formula. So I wrote CXHXOX because it's going to be some ratio of these three elements. And fuel. So fossil fuels are going to be either CXHX or CXHXOX. But if you understand kind of chemistry in general, you'll see how many different places it plays out in so many different concepts across many fields of science. We're going to really kind of simplify cellular respiration to what I need you to know. So we're going to say oxygen in, CO2 out. That's what the animals do. And photosynthesis, what the plants do, CO2 in, oxygen out. Okay, let's do a nice diagram of the carbon cycle, a very simple one. Okay, let's draw the atmosphere. I'm just going to draw a cloud in the sun, label it atmosphere. And we said the first step is CO2 going from the atmosphere into plants via photosynthesis. Then animals, I also want to mention this is the same whether they are plants on land or plants in the ocean. We have a lot of photosynthetic tiny critters in the ocean, so it's going to follow. In this case, we would just have fish eating these little photosynthetic plant life instead of a pig and snake. Now, animals are going to then eat the plants, so the carbon's going to go from the plants to the animals. Then, via consumption, then these guys are going to respire, okay, or undergo cellular respiration and pump that CO2 back into the atmosphere. That's our short cycle. Our long cycle is if no one eats the plants or animals here, they can potentially just die, get buried, and eventually form fossil fuels over many, many millions of years. Those fossil fuels will contain vast amounts of carbon that will be stored in the lithosphere until humans dig it up. Via mining, drilling, again, fracking, any sort of way we access those, and then we burn those fossil fuels to, generate our electricity, to make our cars go, for manufacturing, all sorts of things. And then again, via combustion, we're putting the carbon in the fossil fuels back into the atmosphere, again in the form of CO2. Now, I want you to make sure that you put this at the top or somewhere where it looks important. The reason we care is because human action is interfering with this natural cycle by putting CO2 into the atmosphere faster than nature can remove it. So we're getting kind of this sink, if you want to call it that carbon sink, is overflowing, but there's nowhere for it to go. It can only go so fast in the plants. And this is actually further being complicated by the fact that deforestation that we talked about is a real thing. The fewer plants that you have, the slower you're going to be able to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we're doing so many different things that are making this problem worse and worse and worse. Okay, take-home points for today. Number 1, carbon is naturally cycled through the Earth's reservoirs, aka its sinks, and the sinks are, again, the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. Number 2, carbon provides living things with energy and structure. And number 3, humans have interfered with this natural cycle by burning fossil fuels. And again, I kind of like the metaphor, it's like we're overflowing our atmospheric sink. All right, guys, that is it for today. I will see you tomorrow. Have a good day.